Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, which for more than a year I've been unhappily reporting is still wrapped in a pandemic. It's easy for those of us in the United States and a couple other developing countries to get comfortable with the situation. We have got 200 million shots, I think, in arms now, and more on the way, but the global statistics are grim. We haven't reached 1 billion people on a planet of 7.8 billion people who've been vaccinated, even partially. So vaccine inequity still dominates the hashtag vaccine equity. And until that happens, there's no comfort for anybody, because this virus, the longer it has a big playing field to play around in, the more you'll have variants emerging and the more trouble we'll have keeping it stifled. Taiwan right now is seeing an outbreak. So I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute and Climate School at Columbia University. I'm going to be taking the background here for a change. This is a special session of Sustain What, which is our frequent webcast on complex issues that are consequential and how you use conversation to go forward in the face of complexity. This is like session number 200 or so. And today we're partnering with some other folks here, Insight and the Sociology Department, and particularly the Mellon-Sawyer Seminar on Trust and Mistrust of Experts. And I'm going to be turning over momentarily to the guy who's literally written the book on expertise, Professor of Sociology Gil Ayal. And you'll hear more, of course, in a few minutes from Naomi Oreskes, who's a fantastic historian with geology background at Harvard, who's written seminal books on the interface of science and society. Was like me, a member of the Anthropocene Working Group, among other things, and is just a really powerful force in these questions. And Mike Hulme, who is at Cambridge now. I got to know Mike long before that through his first book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, which really caught my attention as a journalist 2003 or so. I think, does that sound about right? We'll learn, we'll get the dates right in a second. So basically, I'll say, Gil, over to you, and you can do the rest of the introductions. And later we'll hear from Danielle Thompson, who's a PhD candidate in this arena, and will be helping guide the discussion and asking some questions. So good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Andy. As Andy said, this is sort of a double billing and a triple header event. It's shared between the Mellon-Sawyer Seminar on Trust and Mistrust of Experts and Sustain What. And we are really grateful to Andy for hosting this and making this possible through his both platform and vast network. In terms of the Mellon-Sawyer Seminar, this is our second event this term, dealing with the question of climate science and trust in climate science. Our previous event, we had three social scientists who provided their perspective. This time around, we are joined by Naomi Oreskes, Mike Hulme, and Andy will play the role of a super discussant and interlocutor. And we asked our panelists 4 questions, but they are by no means bound to them or limited by them. These were admittedly sort of simplistic questions meant to just start something that hopefully will transcend those questions. We asked them, what are the sources of skepticism about climate change and or mistrust of climate science? What processes, mechanisms, dynamics are implicated in provoking and prolonging the debate about climate change? To what extent are these specific to the climate debate, and to what extent they are representative of a broader mistrust of experts? And what can be done to increase trust in climate science or consensus around some appropriate measures and interventions? As I said, these are just meant as a rough launching pad for discussion, and hopefully we can transcend these questions as we go along. Let me just introduce the panelists and say very, very quickly how we'll proceed. Naomi Oreskes is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University. Her most recent book is Why Trust Science at Princeton University Press. It grew out of Naomi's Tanner lectures on human values at Princeton University. And she's also, as I'm sure you know, co-author of the hugely successful and widely read Merchants of Doubt, came out in 2010, and I believe has come out in a second edition with an introduction by Al Gore. Very few academic books get to be turned into documentaries, translated and distributed in 9 different languages by Sony Pictures Classics, but Merchants of Doubt is that kind of book. But as you notice, so Merchants of Doubt and Why Trust Science, the arguments of these 2 books, in some respects, are directly pertinent to the questions just posed. Mike Halm is a professor of human geography at the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, also a fellow of Pembroke College. His most recent book, coming out this July, is simply titled Climate Change, or The Idea of Climate Change, an important nuance, and is being published as part of the Routledge series Key Ideas in Geography. This book updates the argument of Mike's 2009 book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, which came out with Cambridge University Press. So we have Why Trust Science and Why We Disagree About Climate Change. It seems that our questions are answered with more questions, but hopefully some answers will emerge. I don't need to introduce Andy because he's the host, but I still need to say something, right? Especially to people who may not have logged into Sustain What in the past and are joining in from the Mellon-Sawyer Seminar. So for their benefit, Andy is the director of the Initiative on Communication Innovations and Impact at the Earth Institute, soon to be the Climate School at Columbia University, but he's also one of America's most honored and experienced environmental journalists, with a record of more than 30 years of writing revelatory and moving reports and essays from the battlefronts of environmental struggles, like the Brazilian rainforest. At Columbia, he has dedicated himself to addressing this question of the communications gap, and indeed the trust gap, between science and society. And finally, as noted before, we also have a graduate student fellow of the Mellon-Sawyer Seminar, Danielle Thompson, who is writing her PhD at the School of Journalism, Department of Communications, a dissertation about right-wing media influences, ethnographic research of that delightful group. She will join in at the end with some questions prepared for the panelists. I intended to have another graduate student fellow, Danielle Carr, but I haven't seen her, so hopefully we'll hear from her later. So the floor is yours, Naomi, and take it from here.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Gillen. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. So I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about why I wrote the book, Why Trust Science, and just summarizing the argument for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet. So the reason I wrote the book was because this was a question that people were asking me. So after Merchants of Doubt came out, or even before, but particularly after, I was invited to give enormous numbers of public lectures. And often in these lectures, I would take the time to explain the basic science involved in our understanding of anthropogenic climate change, to talk about the history of science, because I am a historian of science, why scientists even became interested in this question in the first place, what kinds of techniques and tools they had used to examine it, and what evidence they had come to that had led to the conclusion that the climate was changing because of human activities, and that many, if not all, but most of these changes would be costly and in some cases very dangerous. And sometimes when I would give these talks, at the end of it, somebody would stand up in the audience, usually belligerently, but sometimes not, and just say, well, that's all very well and good, but why trust science? And I thought, well, fair enough. You know, in my teaching, my classes, I always try to take seriously the questions that students bring to the table. And I thought, this is a legitimate question. It's legitimate for people to ask that question, because if we're presenting all this scientific information, all this history of science, and just taking it for granted that of course people should trust science, that's really not adequate. And so I took on board the idea that it was a legitimate question that deserved a legitimate, principled, and serious answer, but a serious answer that could be posed in plain language. In other words, not a serious academic book, but a serious book. And so that's what I tried to do in this book. And my answer to the question is essentially, well, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that we should trust science because it has a track record of success. When it comes to understanding both the natural and the social world, scientists, both natural and social scientists, have been doing this project that we call science for a long time. Certainly in the natural sciences, we can identify a pretty continuous history that goes back at least to the 17th century. And although the methods of science have, of course, changed and evolved with time, we can still recognize substantial continuities, particularly institutional continuities, that allow us to use the term science in a meaningful way. And we can see an enormous track record of success in understanding the natural world, providing explanations with great explanatory power, and using that knowledge to do things in the world, like cure diseases, develop effective vaccinations, etc. But how do scientists achieve that? Where did that track record of success come from? And so in the book, I argue two things. The first is that if we think about what science is, it can be understood and viewed in a number of different ways. But one way is that it's the work that scientists do. And that work is the sustained engagement with the natural world. And so one crucial part of the scientific enterprise is that engagement. Just the fact that every day scientists get up and they go to work, and the work they do is to engage with the natural world in order to try to understand it. Now, in my field in history of science, there have been thousands and thousands of books written about that sustained engagement. And most of my previous work is about that. So I didn't think it would be too interesting to focus on that. What I wanted to focus on in this book was the second part, which is to say, what happens when a scientist engaged with the natural world thinks they've figured something out? That's not the end of the story. In some ways, that's just the beginning. And this is where I draw on the whole long history of work that's been done in philosophy, history, and sociology of science, and I draw my own background in science studies. The next thing that happens is that that claim has to be vetted. And it's not vetted by the scientist who made the claim in the first place. It's vetted by a community of fellow experts. And that critical vetting of claim, I argue, is really crucial to why we should believe that claims that have withstood this scrutiny have some reasonable likelihood of being true. And here I draw heavily on feminist philosophy of science, particularly the work of people like Helen Longino and Sandra Harding, who have argued that this critical vetting by different people with different points of view helps to ensure that no one perspective, no one set of biases or values dominates. Sorry, I'm getting feedback, so I was slightly distracting, but I'll try to stay focused here. So this, of course, leads to an important feminist argument, but I think it's one that applies broadly, that it is important for this project to work, the project of science, that the community be diverse. If all the people in the community are looking at the problem in just one way, then it could be that they have substantial blind spots or prejudices, which could lead to wrong or erroneous conclusions. And certainly we see that in the history of science. So then that leads to one more question with respect to our topic today, which is climate change. The book is not about climate change. The book attempts to step back from climate change and answer this question more broadly. So the answer would apply to vaccinations or evolutionary theory or any question about science that people might be interested in. But with respect to climate change, one of the things I argue is that if we look at the climate science community, one thing that's good about it is that it's very big and it's very diverse. There are a lot of different scientists now who have worked in climate change. They've worked on it from many, many different perspectives, both methodological and disciplinary. They come from the global north and the global south. We can ask questions about how well the voices of the global south are heard, for example, at the IPCC, but they are there. And methodologically, the work is very, very diverse. So we have people who study coral reefs, people who do climate modeling, people who study ice cores, people who look at sedimentary records in lakes. So we have a lot of different evidence coming from different people in different places and collected by different means. So we've really looked at this question from an incredible range of different topics, and we've been doing this work for a long time. Scientists have been seriously and continuously engaged with this question of man-made climate change, at least through the 1950s and arguably before. So that basically comes up to a picture that tells us, are we sure that this is all absolutely correct? No, of course not. Nothing in science can ever be said to be absolutely positively sure. But do we have reason to believe that the findings are likely to be reliable in their domains of expertise? And the answer, I argue, is yes. Now, I'll just say one more thing, which I think will lead into some of the things that I know Mike is concerned about. One of the important caveats here is the one I just gave about the areas of expertise. Scientists are experts. They spend a lot of time training to become experts in specific fields and often in narrow areas of specific fields. So not just cryogenic science, but ice sheet modeling. And that means almost by definition that, the more, what's the old saying about an expert is someone who knows, more and more about less and less. So that is true in most science. And so it does mean that scientists need to be disciplined and exercise a bit of self-restraint, in my opinion, in areas that are outside their expertise. And it means that we, as the public, the consumers of information, have not just the right, but we should be alert and mindful and sometimes properly skeptical when scientists make claims outside their domain. And that includes particularly, it goes in all directions, but particularly we've sometimes seen physical scientists make big claims about areas that, Mike and I would consider social science, and that's a red flag. And we also see sometimes, emergence of doubt. We talked a lot about physicists who use their authority and their social position as physicists to make claims about sciences in which they actually had no expertise. So that's the caveat, or it's one of the important caveats in this story. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Naomi. We'll go to Mike. I believe Mike has some slides to share, and Andy will take care of that, right?
Okay, great. Thank you. So in my remarks, I want to put forward the argument that whatever crisis in science or mistrust of experts that might be perceived to exist around climate change, it's not primarily a problem that publics have either with science in general or with the idea of expertise. Rather, I want to situate the problem more broadly, which is the problem of democracy. Or more precisely, it's a problem of how to make decisions about far-reaching climate policies which carry legitimacy and which therefore gain the assent of the people. So next slide. To use an example, British politician Michael Gove's oft-quoted comment from the 2016 Brexit referendum here in the UK that the British people seem to have had enough of experts was a clumsy way of saying something important. People were suspicious of experts, inappropriately foreclosing questions that are, to use Alvin Weinberg's formulation, transscientific. And of course, the world has many transscientific questions which exceed the competence and the legitimacy of scientists or experts solely to answer. Climate change, we could think, is the mother of them all in that regard. So it's not science per se that publics distrust. Surveys show persistently that well over 75% of Americans believe in the public benefits of science, and nor is it even climate science that's disbelieved. There's always been roughly at least somewhere between 60 or 70% of Americans who accept that humans influence the climate. With climate change, the problem arises when people perceive that arguments are being made and decisions then being taken, that there is only one right way to respond, a way that is determined by science, by scientists, or by advocates who claim that this or that is what the science demands. So next slide. Contra Michael Gove, what people have had enough with within public debates and advocacy campaigns around climate change are slogans such as "listen to the scientists" or "the science demands we do that." And let me illustrate this in a different way, using something I know a little about, the ClimateGate controversy that erupted back in 2009 at my old university, University of East Anglia. Next slide. So ClimateGate was a controversy because it appeared that climate scientists were undermining the idea of a well-ordered science, or what Naomi has written about in her book she's just described as the conditions necessary to reach a fair and open consensus. Now, we can discuss the extent to which this appearance was real or manufactured. That's not my point today. My point is this: climate change became a crisis because so much was being staked by both ends of the political spectrum on science providing the direction and justification for political action or inaction. It was a crisis because of the undermining of the probity of the science upon which it was believed, or at least it was claimed, all sensible climate policy depended. Most notably at the time, this included the prominent UK environmental commentator George Monbiot. And from this standpoint, science and scientists then have to be pure, to use Stephen Shapin's word, or unimpeachable, which was actually what Monbiot demanded at the time, as he called upon climate scientists, including Phil Jones, to resign. Monbiot said, "I've never felt so alone." Science had let him down. Similarly, the subsequent Glaciergate crisis a few months later with the IPCC prompted the Dutch Environment Minister, Jacqueline Kramer, to state, quote, "I will not tolerate one further error in the IPCC." Well, I think politics is in a dangerous place if it cannot tolerate errors in science. So my argument is that the heart of climate skepticism is not a nefarious fossil fuel industry sowing doubt about science or expertise. Not yet.
Sorry.
They undoubtedly have done so, as Naomi has pointed out, of course. But this is rather peculiar or distinctive to American or perhaps Anglophone cultures. Climate skepticism in Russia, France, India, or China, for example, I don't think is synonymous with such fossil fuel interventions. Climate skepticism has broader roots than this. Mistrust in science is always bound up with other things: politics, culture, ethics, the law. Skepticism often arises from people observing how science and expert judgment is being mobilized in debates that are essentially political. In other words, climate skeptics are suspicious about how different interests and values of public actors concerning climate change are being resolved by those in power. Skepticism therefore points to the problem of legitimation. It is the problem of how science and how experts relate or are perceived to relate to a democracy. The problem is one of when and how to open up public debate and when and how to close down, to use Andy Sterling's metaphor of opening up and closing down. And this requires us to recognize that how one closes down depends on the political culture you're in. How Russia deals with this is very different from how China, the United States, or Germany or Britain will do it. So in conclusion, I've got three don'ts and three do's for climate scientists, academics, or advocates concerned about the place of climate science and expertise in society, concerned about the relationship between science, expertise, and public discourse in the challenging circumstances of a changing climate. The don'ts come first. So don't put experts in control. Next slide. It's surprising to me how many leading scientists, climate scientists, seem to favor a Platonic form of governance. That is, favoring a technocracy, the rule of the wise, over a democracy. Take this example from Chris Rapley, the professor of climate science at UCL London, speaking just recently in response to the WMO's 2020 report on the state of climate and citing the novel The March of Folly by the US historian Barbara Tuchman. Rapley says, quote, "The issue is not of science, but of politics. What precautions and safeguards are available to root out the individuals in power who perpetrate folly? Plato suggested that the ruling class in a just society should be drawn from the rational and the wise. It's time for an uprising of concerted action to fix politics. Managing the climate crisis will follow." In contrast, rather than leading to a revolution to put experts in control, which almost seems to be what Rapley is calling for, Juliette Kayyem at Harvard's Kennedy School calls for scientists to, quote, "stay in your lane," and warns against the lure of, quote, "rock star status that can make you think that everyone wants your opinion on anything." Second don't demonize one's opponents. Now, to stand in here, I'm going to use the case of Michael Mann, next slide, and his militarist vocabulary. The German theorist Karl von Clausewitz characterized war as, quote, "an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will." This is not a good way to think about climate politics in a democracy. In wars, there are winners and losers, sides are taken, and the solution is conquering and defeating the enemy. As John Besley at Michigan State University asks, do we want people to see scientists as angry, embattled, frustrated people, or rather people who are doing their best to solve problems to make the world better? Danger with the combative climate militancy espoused by man is that it ends up being a destructive form of advocacy. Third don't, next slide. Don't create an emergency out of a condition. Declarations of emergencies create states of exception, often justified by governments under conditions of war, pandemics, as we've seen, insurrection or terrorist threat. Emergencies promise the mass mobilization of a jurisdiction's full economic, social, and technical capacities to ward off an existential threat. Yet, at the same time, emergencies threaten constitutional rights, justify the suspension of normal politics, and legitimate rule by experts or technocrats. Following political declarations of emergency, the goals of public policy become worryingly focused on a reductive set of indicators. In the case of climate change, this might be securing net zero carbon emissions by a given date, for example. But meeting the challenge of climate change for future human well-being, I argue, demands a proliferation of diverse policy goals, the very opposite of what a state of exception brings into being. So then the corollary, 3 do's to finish with, 3 do's. First of all, recognize the limits of science, slide 8. As John Dewey and Hannah Arendt, among many others, have shown, scientific facts do not carry their political or ethical meanings with them. Facts cannot speak for themselves. Or indeed, on most complex public policy questions, such as climate change, there is, as Dan Sarowitz has argued, a surfeit of facts. Sarowitz goes on to explain the error to which scientific experts can be drawn. Our expectations, quote, he says, for Enlightenment ideals of applied rationality are themselves irrational. We are asking science to do the impossible, to arrive at scientifically coherent and politically unifying understandings of problems that are inherently open, indeterminate, and contested. Julie Staiano, Chief Philanthropy Officer at the AAAS, said recently, and I think he was correct in this, he said, but, quote, but as we've also seen, evidence cannot speak for itself. We must have the right message, he said, and the right messengers. Okay, but then what is the right message if the facts don't speak for themselves? Next slide. And this takes us to underlying values in these public policy debates. You certainly won't find the message of climate facts by finding out more facts. No, political consensus does not follow from scientific consensus. And certainly not for climate change, where the scientific consensus is actually over a relatively minimal set of claims about human influence on the climate system. To find the message, we have to turn to underlying values. And here, scientists have no special privilege. Expose the values of scientists, yes, that's fine, but also focus on the values of those different political actors whose values will differ. Politics can only work when we realize that there is no right message hidden in the facts. Expose the different interests at stake in climate change and don't let these interests hide behind the facade of value-neutral science. Only then can legitimate agonisms unfold without some playing the fake trump card of the science demands. And it's towards this goal that a lot of my own work and writing on climate change over the past 15 years has been directed, starting with the book Andy mentioned at the beginning, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And then finally, the third do, invest in political institutions and processes. Next slide. Good politics needs much more than good science. For issues like climate change, investing in new participatory and agonistic forms of democracy, where value conflicts and political disagreements are acknowledged, voiced, and worked with, is as important, perhaps more important, than investing in new scientific or technical knowledge. And there's a balance here between the twin dangers, as I see them. On the one hand, of the crisis politics of emergency, and on the other, perpetually kicking the can down the road. But good politics requires agonistic listening, to quote Chantal Mouffe, or what Nicholas Rescher calls the pursuit of acquiescence amongst a polity in a decision, rather necessarily than consensual agreement. And Rescher has got quite a lot to say about those conditions, preconditions of acquiescence. Have all interested parties been heard? Has their case been understood? Have their concerns been recognized by those in power? And I would argue that overemphasizing narrow science-based indicators like global temperature, net zero emissions, or the emotional rhetoric of 10 more years, these are in danger, can be in danger of offering poor substitutes or shortcuts for political forms of closure. And they may well contribute to the suspicion or mistrust that some actors, some of our citizens may have in scientists or in experts. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike, for this powerful statement. Andy?
Yeah, well, you know, as a journalist, I'll lay out the journalistic perspective on these issues of expertise first, and then maybe we can get into some back and forthing. Journalism, to me, having covered science now for 35 years, feels a lot like science. It's just that the peer review comes after publication. That's the only real hardcore difference. We're all exploratory. We're all poking at consequential questions, trying to figure out veracity. You know, trust but verify is not just a Reagan slogan. It's the norm of journalism is not trust but and verify, and then cross-check and find out what's real. And I think Naomi's book and Mike's, all of Mike's scholarship, and have really hit on some really important points here that what I'll lay out present a real enormous challenge when even in conventional journalism as we knew it, you know, back in the day of this, my first cover story on global warming, you know, 1988, it was fact checked. It was this is before the IPCC, was the year Jim Hansen was testifying, and that process had its own sense of what's news. Well, news. This cover is not. That's not muted colors, right? It's the colors of emergency, and this was 1988. It succeeded a cover story I did on nuclear winter in 1985. Actually, I happen to have that right here too. So here's my cover story on nuclear winter, 1985. Look at the Earth in an ice cube. And here's 1988, the Earth on fire, melting on a hot plate. So unfortunately, journalism is a distilling process, right? To get someone's attention, especially in a world where most everyone's attention is not on issues like climate change or nuclear deterrence. It's on the day, getting through the day, whether you're rich or poor. It's on the stock market. It's on the political questions of the day. It's on a pandemic for the past 14 months. And even there, of course, we could talk for an hour just about the lessons learned and unlearned revealed by the pandemic. So the journalistic process theoretically has the same qualities as science to me. You're not actually testing with devices and with observation. Well, observations, yes, right? But not in a way that's purely objective in that sense of the basic scientific process of looking at the structure of DNA. And now think about that in the context of social media, where there is no front page, where whoever now, who is the Walter Cronkite of our day or the BBC equivalent? So you're out there in the media market being saturated with your view of the science, some predisposed aspect of it, or with your view of the controversy, which gets at Mike's point about, you know, yelling, creating a hero-villain narrative here, actually serves the heroes and whoever your sense of the villain is. It serves both ends because it amplifies the crystal, sort of the brittle edges of arguments instead of saying, you know, there's tough questions here. And anyone who thinks this is just about climate denial is fantasizing, because take it, I show a slide quite frequently of my friends Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen, who have tied them. They've literally handcuffed themselves to the same fences. They know the science. I mean, Bill started writing on climate change a year after I did, and so he knows the science deeply. And he and Jim Hansen have chained themselves to the fence at the White House, chained themselves to the fence at coal plants, and they have completely divergent views of the solution. Completely divergent. Jim wrote famously that if you believe renewable energy can decarbonize the planet, you also believe in the tooth fairy. That's Jim Hansen, environmental hero of the planet. And Bill McKibben, when Fukushima happened, wrote, we have to turn off all these plants. They're too brittle. And even today, most of the environmental movement is saying no to nuclear power. I live 10 miles from Indian Point, which was just shut off after generating clean power for 753 days nonstop at huge scale. 20% of the U.S. grid is nuclear power, but try to get a rational conversation, a data-based conversation on nuclear power, and you realize, oh my God, this is tough. And by the way, my wife is very happy the plant turned off. I'm not happy. So we love each other. She's an environmental educator. I'm an environmental journalist, and we know how to live with each other. Some of the musicians I play music with are stridently opposed to fracking, have been since that issue percolated in New York State. And I'm kind of I've got that overview approach. The gas is going to come from somewhere. The 5 million homes in the Northeast, like ours, that heat on oil, not even gas, because we're not on a gas line, and there never will be one built because of NIMBY, the NIMBY factor. So it's a landscape, as Mike was saying, of deep complexity. One of the paths forward to me, and I think both of you get at this really well, is something I learned from, it's a philosopher point, but I learned it from a climate scientist, Ken Caldera. I guess he undergraduate, he minored in philosophy. I took one course in philosophy as an undergrad. I lament that. He brought me back to Hume and the is-ought problem, that you can't get an ought from an is. Science basically reveals the is around us, including the is of what we don't know. And the ought is all that values-related stuff, either a function of your tribal affiliation, your function of your worldview. The ought for some is no nukes. The ought for some is yes nukes. But those judgments are not, they're framed on several things. I think part of it is biological. We have different views of the world depending on our upbringing, but I do think there's some sense of, within our nature part of us, inherently different concepts of risk. And think about this. I talk about this quite often. Risk diversity, response diversity is a characteristic that ecosystem scientists have identified as long ago as 2003 as a source of resilience in ecosystems. Thomas Elmquist in Stockholm wrote a really important paper on response diversity. And what he said, basically, what they found is that ecosystems that are able to handle an environmental stress are the ones where the species and different functional components of an ecosystem have a variety of responses to the stress. And when I read that, I was so excited about this, because I thought in the social context, on an issue as momentous and complicated as global warming, on a planet as big and complicated as Earth, we want response diversity. Could you imagine if we all were no nukes people, or we all were yes renewables people, or the vice versa? And we would hit walls really quickly. And in policy too, you don't want one policy. Tom Friedman said we should be China for a day. I don't want to be China for a day if it means having Uyghur prisoners making solar panels, right? I personally don't want that, but I do understand what he's getting at. We need scale. So, but how do you storify that? That's a newsroom term. How do you storify that? And ultimately, I'll conclude with the reason I'm not doing a lot of this these days. I've written 5 books. I've got a new one over there on the human planet, on the Anthropocene, with a great photographer. But I spend most of my days working on conversation models. Like, how do you get some sense of cooperation amid deep dispute, especially amid deep uncertainty, which is what we're surrounded by. on these issues, not just manufactured uncertainty, and make progress, you know. And that entails communication innovation at a different level from telling a better story in a magazine or a new book and the like. So that's kind of where I come to this from. And I draw heavily on everything I've heard here, you know, in thinking about this stuff these days. You know, the initiative I've tried at Columbia, what I'm trying to do, what I did with my blog at the Times, you know, when I started in 2007, .earth, there was no editor who said, hey, we need an environmental blog, Andy. I drew to blogging because it felt like a better fit for these grand questions that are complex and prismatic, where nobody's totally wrong and nobody's totally right. So that's the adventure as I see it right now.
Great, thank you, Andy. You guys are also polite and respectful of one another. Hopefully the questions will get you to drop that. We'll see. But if Danielle can come into the platform, yes. And I think
There's
Danielle,
two
and
Danielles.
also Danielle Carr is another graduate fellow in the seminar. She's a student in anthropology at Columbia. And I hope I get it right, a dissertation about the history and ethnography of brain implants. Okay, so Danielle, please take us to some questions that you have prepared for our panelists.
Danielle, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Can you guys all hear me all right? Okay, so I guess first of all, thank you very much to Gil and to the other fellows for all the work that went into this, and thank you very, very much to our excellent panelists who has been extremely fascinating. So I have my first question for all of you is that I think that we've kind of been through a really interesting counter case, right, with the case of vaccine skepticism, which at one point was, you know, high enough in the public to threaten to derail public response, right? And we've seen a kind of remarkable pivot over the past few weeks with a rapid uptick of trust in public science and trust in the vaccines. And it looks like, you know, things are going to be okay there, at least in the US. And so I guess I would just be really interested to hear some of the reflections on the difference between these two cases, because obviously the structure and conditions are the same in both, right? You still have what we could think of as the JSTOR problem, right? Or lack of public access to things like peer review. We still have problems with scientific literacy. We still have problems with social media. And so, like, what do you like? How do we theorize these two cases together to cast light on the climate change problem?
I could jump in here because I think one of the challenges of this situation, I think both Mike and my work speak to, is that these are extremely complex issues, and it can't just be simply reduced to the idea of trust in science or trust in experts. And so I think, you know, you said the last few weeks we've seen an uptick in trust in vaccines. I don't know that that's true. I think we don't actually have a really good handle on what many people are feeling and thinking about this issue. But the fact that people's responses are changing, evolving with time, doesn't necessarily mean that their fundamental trust in science changed. And I think we need a lot more work on that to better understand. But, you know, I mean, I just spent 2 months in Utah, which was a great experience because I have good friends, people I like, people I respect there who are not getting vaccinated. And I also have friends there who are religious Mormons who are. And I think this speaks to Mike's point about this landscape is really complicated. And there are a lot of different things, a lot of different factors interacting in ways that can generate changes that we can't easily always explain with simple models of, you know, oh, it's just about trust in experts. But I think this is also a good example that gives me an opportunity to respond to something that Andy said. And one of the problems about scientists who know a little philosophy. So, you know, Ken Calder is a great scientist, and I respect the science he's done. But, you know, the is-ought distinction is really, really problematic, and scientists invoke it all the time. And you see this in the IPCC with the policy relevant but not policy prescriptive mantra. And I encountered it when I was doing my work with Michael Oppenheimer and Dale Jameson when we wrote the book Discerning Experts. We had so many scientists who told us, oh, they were totally clear what they were doing. They're just doing the science and they're handing it over to policymakers. But then when we actually looked at what they said in public and private, at what they you know, in their talks, then it was much more like what Mike was pointing out, well, sometimes they stayed in their lane and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes they said things about, I'll use your example of nuclear power because that's one that, bothers me. Sometimes they would say things about nuclear power that were factually incorrect, and so this gets really tricky. And the is-ought distinction is tricky for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the key reasons is because it's not that clear a distinction. It's clear in theory, it's clear philosophically, but when you actually try to apply it, it's not so clear. And I think one of the reasons for that is because what we ought to do does in fact depend upon what is. So let's take the COVID example. So we get this new virus that we don't understand very well, but it looks that it's pretty darn dangerous. And that if we do nothing and just let it spread through the population, millions of Americans could die. And of course, equivalent numbers elsewhere. So what happens? Well, some people who don't want the federal government to act on the issue or don't want to have mass mandates for whatever reasons, political, value-laden, economic, whatever, and there could be a variety of those reasons, they start arguing about the is. They start arguing about how deadly this thing really is. And they start arguing with the scientists about what the scientists know about how risky, how contagious, how virulent this virus actually is. So they start arguing about the is because they actually don't like the implied ought. And that's exactly what we've seen in climate change. And that's what so much of my work is about, right? Why? And I totally agree with what Mike said about, this is a super complex question in which the science is one of several important components. But why do we see the people who don't want to, let's say, put a price on carbon, fighting about the facts about climate change, right? If the is-ought distinction was clear, those people should be able to say, yes, we agree climate change is happening. We agree it's caused by fossil fuels and deforestation. But now let's argue about what to do about it, right? And that would be the rational response in the world where is and ought could be clearly separated. But that's not what we've seen happen, particularly in the United States. And again, also agree with Mike, this is different in different countries. But my work focused on the US particularly because it was different, because we were seeing this peculiar and distinctive problem in the United States, which was not happening in England at that time, or in France or Germany or other places, Australia, where I was spending time. So what do these people do? They don't just say, let's have a robust political conversation about the different policy options and the relative priorities, all things that I agree with Mike about. They start arguing with the scientists about the facts. They start denying the facts. And so that, to me, implies a really important thing, that they don't see the is and ought as being separate. They see the is as actually leading almost inextricably to certain oughts that they don't like or that threaten their economic interests. And that's why these get muddled. That's why they get conflated. And that's why the debate then becomes incredibly hard to sort out, because the scientists will come in and say, well, here's more science, more facts, more facts, more facts. Because in a way, the scientists are also conflating them, right? The scientists are thinking, well, it's what Mike said, the science demands. And I totally agree with what you said about that, Mike. I've on many occasions said to colleagues, I really don't think you should say that, right? The science doesn't actually demand anything. The scientist tells us stuff that's going on, and then we have to make decisions about what we do or don't do about it. So, but the scientists, so in a way, both sides are falling into the same conflation. The scientists think that if they can establish what is, that will automatically tell us what ought to happen. But the people who are also resisting what, quote, ought to happen are fighting the facts because they're actually buying into the same conflation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, I mean, sorry, Daniela, we're moving away from your vaccine question. Maybe I'll have a word about that at the moment. But just on this is ought, or what Naomi just said there, that's absolutely true. But we need to be symmetrical about this diagnosis too, because I would argue in some of the early, the first early public forays around climate change in the 1980s, actually it was environmental organizations that made that first connection between, well, this is what the state of climate is, and this is what humans are doing to the climate system. And so inevitably it follows from that you have to get rid of the fossil industry or renewables or whatever else it might be. When the first IPCC report was published in 1990, Greenpeace published their own volume criticizing that IPCC report on the grounds that it was it was a compromised report, because what Greenpeace were looking for was a scientific statement that actually would justify what Greenpeace's particular policy prognosis was. The IPCC didn't fulfill that as far as Greenpeace were concerned, and so they started criticizing the IPCC because they thought of this seamless move from science to policy. It just happened to be Greenpeace policy rather than ExxonMobil's policy. So I think we need to be symmetrical about all political actors here in different ways. They've all sought, as it were, to appropriate climate science as some form of justificatory narrative for their particular set of policy proposals. Just back on the vaccine issue, I mean, I think Naomi's right that there are many more dimensions to trust than we could simply extract from a single poll on a particular issue. And I suppose the equivalent, trying to read across from vaccines to climate change, what is the equivalent? You know, so do we have a vaccine? You know, what is the vaccine to either to stop climate change happening or to prevent us from being exposed to the risks of climate change? There isn't one. Clearly, there isn't one, and there can't possibly be. And it isn't just renewables, or it isn't just sunlight reflection methods in the stratosphere. You know, all these searches for single bullet solutions for climate change are doomed to fail because there is no single bullet solution to climate change. It has got far too many dimensions to it, and it's deep. You know, the underlying processes of climate change are so deeply embedded in contemporary late modern society that, you know, we're not going to unravel those processes through a particular vaccine, to use that as a metaphor. So I don't think one can simply read that phenomenon, whatever those polls are saying in America. I don't think you can read that across into climate change to say that, you know, we're just looking for some. Well, I suppose what would be the equivalent? I mean, even if you go for nuclear, you know, if you go for nuclear fusion, does that solve climate change? Well, it may solve some aspects of climate change, but actually what publics have come to understand about climate change are all of the other dimensions that get mobilized around this issue. You know, it's around the centralization of power or the decentralization of power. It's around the sort of food we eat. It's actually about legacies of colonialism as much as about anything. And you're not going to unravel the legacies of colonialism just by having nuclear fusion or by injecting aerosols into the stratosphere. So I don't think climate change lends itself. The problem structure of climate change is unique to climate change, and this is why it's different again from stratospheric ozone. You know, people back in the 1980s began to start transferring the relationship between science and policy and technology from ozone, stratospheric ozone, into climate change. But climate change is an entirely different problem structure than stratospheric ozone depletion. It doesn't lend itself to that type of techno-centered solution.
Yeah. Let me offer a quick input on the is-ought problem. I think I agree. Ken Caldera doesn't use it to say scientists should not engage in policy, and neither do I. In fact, when I've talked with scientists, groups of scientists about this, I say, to me, what it revealed is the opportunity to speak to the public on your zone of expertise, if you're a glaciologist or a modeler or a sociologist, and then to stop and in the second sentence to say, I'm a human being and a citizen and a voter, and I think we need a carbon tax. And that is a way to sort of be the person and be the expert and create some sense of a delineation in your own mind so that the audience who's listening can start to understand maybe a little bit that you're signaling. Just because I'm an expert doesn't mean I know everything, and but I am a human being. I make my judgments on that scale. I'm just going to show a slide. Perrin Ireland, who's an illustrator who now works at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, she heard me talk about this and she made it into a slide, into a cartoon, the is-ought problem. That's why this is what I study. I'm also a parent, I think. So use two sentences. So I'm not agreeing at all with that woman Mike referred to who said, stay in your lane. We're all in one big lane. This this issue is multidimensional and covers the Earth and covers the future as well as the present. So there's no single lane to stay in anyway. But that, I think, can get us some way of having a rational conversation. And then that leads back to what I was saying about conversation. There are evolving models of journalism are coming around. Your Voice Ohio is used to be the Akron Beacon Journal, doing newspaper stuff like I did for 20 years, putting out stories. And now Your Voice Ohio, driven by the opioid pandemic, they said this issue is too big and monstrous and complicated, and the public's freaked out. What do we do? Well, what they did, they started holding their own town meetings. They didn't send a reporter to a town meeting. They brought in experts. They used the Jefferson Center, which was an early proponent of citizens' juries, to how do you assemble a community in a way that reveals both your passions and your fears and has the access to data where it's needed, and then can have a conversation. Where do we go from here? And I think you're going to see more of that, hopefully, in journalism going forward. Not the special bulletin. The last thing we need is the Guardian enforcing a new style book saying you journalists can no longer call this climate change. You have to call it a climate emergency, a climate breakdown, or what are their other terms, Mike? I don't know if you know. Now they're restricting the words journalists can use to even talk about this, and I think it's silly. And it reminds me of the great Spinal Tap fake documentary where the rock star guitar player has this amplifier. He's showing this filmmaker his home studio, and he says, "And here's my amplifier. It was custom made. It goes to 11." you know, it doesn't mean it's louder. It just goes to 11. I think some of this stuff, the rhetorical stuff, is just trying to move us to 11 on an issue that really that could work in the other direction. There's lots more to say, but those are some initial things.
Let's take a question from Danielle Thompson.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for all of your thoughtful comments and ideas and for being here today with us. I'm very excited about it. So I studied communication in the journalism school, and one of the things that we point out and we are constantly being told is just how little trust there is in the institution of the press, the institution of government, the institution even now of education. And if you look at Pew, trust polls, at least in the United States, the most trusted institution is the military, followed by science. And I fear sometimes now that we've gone, as maybe more liberal or progressive parts of society have leaned into science, as I trust the science because we can't trust media or government anymore, we're going to lean on science, that we risk in some ways sort of killing our darling or something like that. And so one of my questions is sort of like, does science now need its own PR agency in a weird way? I knew this, a group called Upwell. They were a group of narrative comms professionals who made a PR agency for the ocean. Like, what would it look like if we just did PR for the ocean, help people understand what the ocean is, what's going on with the ocean? And it was an interesting narrative sort of experiment. And so I sort of wonder, is this a moment where maybe the experts, they can speak to their own expertise, but it's almost like the institution itself needs almost someone to be out there helping people understand a little more effectively what this process is about. And I think folks like Naomi are doing some of that work, of course, and everyone here is. But sort of like, how can we prevent the risk of losing that trust in science if we keep leaning into it as other institutions lose their trust?
Experts first. Mike or Naomi?
Yeah, well, and thinking about PR for science, I mean, every science institute, most universities have got their PR machinery very well laid out now. Most scientific papers of any significance, come out with a press release, seeking, I guess, media attention, which is what Andy was referring to early on. This crowded space. So institutions that are scientific are actually already participating, if you will, in that game. But I guess what you're asking is something slightly different to that. It's not, and in some senses, actually, those different PR agencies or PR offices in our universities, that they're sort of engaged in a zero-sum game. You know, we're looking for attention for Cambridge University as opposed to Columbia University, in order, unfortunately, it's certainly in many of our cases now, in order to position our universities as higher up in some crazy world league table for the excellence of the scientific research that's being done in one's institution. So it's in that sense, it's a zero-sum game that these forms of public relations exercises are engaged in. What you're talking about is something entirely different. On behalf of what? On behalf of science. I mean, as Naomi's book points out, and as philosophers and historians of science have increasingly pointed out, what actually do we in the end mean by science? It's actually very difficult to put some boundaries between what is and what is not science. It is a continual exercise of boundary work that individual scientists and scientific institutions and learned academies are engaged in regularly in order to try to, as it were, articulate or to give some sense of where these boundaries of science from non-science lie. So I think it would be very hard to. I mean, it's almost your point reminds me too. We could go back, to the old notion of the Republic of Science, Polanyi's argument from the early 1960s. The science is its own self-governing republic, and the social contract, or the contract between society and science, is you give us some money, we'll go and do the science, but just leave us alone. If you've got a self-governing republic, then that self-governing republic can embark on some type of public relations exercise to say, well, this is the value that you as a society get from us as scientists. The quid pro quo, though, is that you leave us alone to do our science. I mean, that model of how science and society relates to each other is long since discredited, and I don't think is very helpful. So I don't know. I'm rather skeptical of thinking that one can mount a full-scale public relations campaign on behalf of science as this sort of rather nebulous, uncontrollable and uncontainable, and the idea that somehow there is some singular brain at the center of global science that's orchestrating or controlling what scientists do or the sort of questions they ask. I don't think that would hold water.
If I could jump in here, I agree with that. And I think one of the things that's interesting, Danielle, you started by talking about the Pew survey, which I also cite in my talks on this topic, as well as the General Social Survey. One of the really interesting things about those data is that they show almost no change in trust in science since 1973. And that's very shocking, I think, to most people when I talk about this, because we have this feeling or this perception that there's this crisis of trust in science, and we have a perception or a feeling that this is a recent thing. But there is no general crisis of trust in science. And the data show a shocking, startling degree of consistency over the last 50 years. So I think that's telling us that actually most people's views of science are not nearly as sensitive to local perturbations, recent events, as many of us assume. Now, it's certainly possible things have changed this year. The data haven't been updated yet. And it's also true that these data we have are very, very high level, right? The General Social Survey, I think, has 3 questions about science, and they're very broad questions. Like, do you think that science generally, works to the benefit of people? That kind of a question. So I think there's just a ton we don't know about this. And I think in a way we've been very unscientific about our claims about science. And I think we need to do a lot more fine-grained work to better understand, what is it people really think when they think about science? What is it, what are these benefits that they perceive are occurring? One thing we do know, I wrote about this in a recent Scientific American column. If you look at the space program, this is a really, really fascinating example. The space program is very popular. Americans like NASA. But there was a recent question that asked folks, well, what is it you would most like NASA to do? And they gave them a set of things. And the really interesting thing was that the top choice was to continue to use space to monitor Earth, like the mission to planet Earthing, and particularly to monitor climate change. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating because I agreed with that. That's kind of what I think would be a useful use of NASA capacity. But it's not what NASA wants to do, right? NASA wants to go back to the moon, and NASA wants to put women on the moon. And so there's clearly some kind of disconnect that NASA thinks that human space flight attracts people and attracts support. Maybe it does attract congressional support. I don't know. I haven't studied that closely. And this perception that maybe if they put a woman on the moon, that somehow people will love NASA for doing that. There's clearly some kind of public relations element involved in what NASA is doing and what they think the American people want. But the data don't actually support that. And it's certainly not what scientists want, because I can't think of a single scientist I know who thinks that human space flight is good value for money.
So a couple of things I'd like to offer. One is that I guess I'll start with the idea of climate change as the focus. One thing I've learned after 35 years of writing about it is a valuable way to go forward on this issue is to stop talking about this emblem, this lapel badge, climate change, climate crisis, and to focus on what it is that we want. You know, what's the outcome we want? We want a safe-ish relationship with the climate system, right? It happens to be a two-way relationship now. It was a one-way relationship. Humans had a one-way relationship with climate for 99.99% of our history. It did stuff. You either died, adapted, or moved. And now it's a two-way relationship. It's taking time for humanity to fully absorb that we are changing the system that is changing us. And then, so you say, okay, well, what do you want from the climate? Well, you want some predictability. You want to have water. You want to have, oh, I'm not quite sure why my camera just failed. That's interesting. You want to have technology that works. Anyway, and then when you do that, you realize, well, there's two levels of risk. There are two big drivers of risk. One is long-term, CO2 and other gases. And one is immediate. What do you do in your community to reduce risk? And there's 1,000 things on that list. And those are all stories. Those are all narratives that can be told now. And you can shout climate crisis for the rest of your life and maybe nudge some needle a tiny bit if enough people do it on the big thing, emissions, but that doesn't give you any benefit on the first one either. Science says that there's inertia in the climate system. So if Greta and all of us who care about this run the world starting tomorrow, it doesn't change hurricane patterns. It doesn't change hurricane losses. I guarantee that, because those are being driven mostly by factors on the ground. The Haitian migrants working in the Bahamas who were hammered by Hurricane Dorian aren't thinking about CO2 reduction if they're thinking about how do I live through the rest of my life and my family live securely here in the Bahamas. They think about justice. They think about reasonable housing. They think about, why did I have to leave Haiti? You know, can I go back to my homeland? And those questions are foreground. So as a journalist, another reason I stopped writing big, banner stories on this is that break it into its pieces and you have action. And the other thing is climate trust in who? Glaciologists, modelers, social scientists of climate, they're all different questions with all different layers. And the more that physical scientists talk to social scientists, the more that modelers talk to observers, the better off we'll be. So crosstalk among the disciplines is really important as well. This isn't just about better communication with the outer world. I once wrote a piece, I think it wasn't a piece, Marika Holland, a great climate modeler at NCAR, the US National Center for Atmospheric Research, dug in a lot on sea ice. Like, how is sea ice going to change in a warming world? I asked her, I was there at Boulder, I said, have you ever been to the Arctic? She said, no. I was like, so I thought, can we at least have a field trip for modelers to have some of the great observational scientists, like, the folks that I went to the North Pole with, talk to modelers and say, hey, can we help you think about how to shape your models? So anyway, it's like, oh, and the last thing, I'm sorry if I'm going on a little long here. This is perhaps the most important thing. Science is very self-serving, right? Journalism is too. I want to stay in business, right? I would like to keep writing the rest of my career. Scientists want to do more science, right? And everything is set up from the newsroom back through the laboratory back to funders, whether it's NSF or anybody else, that are saying more science, more science. And when you actually look at what science has identified through my 30 years interrogating the IPCC reports, it has valuably shown that there are now things I call known unknowables. meaning don't expect AR7 or AR8 or AR9 to clarify in a way that's relevant to policy what's going to happen with the Thwaites ice sheet in Antarctica. Lots of new science. We love it. How many stories have you seen in the last 3 months? Banner stories about the ice sheet from different directions, different science saying complicated and different things about it. So that's a known unknowable to me as a journalist. I could keep writing those incremental stories and get lots of views from people who are already climate concerned. But when is the IPCC going to say, it's very likely we can't help you make decisions? They say it's very likely we know climate is warming and CO2 is part of it. Why don't they also have an extremely likely label for the things they can't do for us?
Can I jump back in here? Because that raises a really important point that I want to make sure that we do cover before we run out of time, which is the political power piece and the power of the fossil fuel industry. So, Andy, you started by talking about the people in Haiti, and you said, well, those people aren't, really thinking about CO2 reduction. But of course, that's true for almost all people, whether they live in Haiti or or Canada or Australia or Zimbabwe or Nigeria or Taiwan or Marshall Islands, whatever. I mean, most people are just living their lives and figuring out how to live their lives in a way that works for them. And that's fine. That's normal. But someone does have to worry about the CO2 reduction piece, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, we all understand that no amount of CO2 reduction fixes this problem this week, next week, or even this decade. But still, someone does have to focus on that. And I think that's where the power of the fossil fuel industry is a crucial part of this story and can't just be brushed aside. Mike began with a sort of, a list of do's and don'ts, and almost all of it are things I agree with. But I think one really important piece, and this is why I focused on it in my work, is that we know that the fossil fuel industry in this country has had a very, very big impact on the public conversation. It's had a big impact on what goes on in Washington, D.C., and it's had a big impact, and we have good evidence to support this, in stopping political action on that level of the big CO2 reductions. And we also know that this has been going on for just, almost as long as the scientists, almost as long as the IPCC has been meeting. Like, they were formed in 88, and in 89, we saw the first, what we could call a climate change denial report coming out of the Marshall Institute. So, and every time that the US Congress has been in a place where people thought there might be some kind of serious action to address the big picture, the CO2 reductions, whether it was through a carbon price, a carbon tax, emissions trading system, whatever it was, the fossil fuel industry has been there lobbying, campaigning, throwing disinformation reports on the desk of every congressperson in the United States of America, fax blasts, phone calls. And we know that hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars have been spent on this. And we also know from the history of technology that 30 years of delay is really significant in terms of having prevented possible solutions, or at least taking the crucial steps towards building alternative energy systems, alternative infrastructures. We could have been a long way in the direction, maybe not solve the whole thing, but we certainly could have made significant progress. And just to use the nuclear fusion example, absolutely, nuclear fusion by itself wouldn't solve climate change. But if it actually worked, and if we could do containable nuclear fusion at an affordable price, it would certainly be a big piece of the solution. But none of that has happened in the United States. And obviously, again, multiple reasons, but the fossil fuel industry has been an important part. And the thing I want to stress here is that I totally agree with Mike's point about, that this is a political problem, but the fossil fuel industry has been a huge part of the politics, particularly in this country, a huge part of shaping and controlling political debate and political action or inaction. And if we don't recognize that, we're missing a big piece of this landscape. And then just the last final point, and what happens in the United States matters because it ramifies around the world. And we have lots of people who participated, for example, in Kyoto, who are really counting on the United States to exercise leadership. The United States pushed hard for emissions trading as the mechanism. And we know that many European countries that weren't necessarily originally that thrilled by emissions trading went along because they thought the US would accept it. And in the end, the United States refused to play ball. And a lot of things fell apart. And then we had the whole narrative of, well, why should the US act if the developing nations aren't acting? But of course, the the whole point of the Annex 1, Annex 2 distinction was the idea that the rich countries that had basically created this problem would act first. And once we took care of that, then we would move on to, the poorer nations, developing nations. But we never even got to that second step because the United States withdrew, refused to ratify Kyoto. And a large part of that, not the whole thing, but a large part of it was the power and the influence of the fossil fuel industry on both the Democratic and Republican side. Because remember, one more, fact, Byrd-Hagel amendment that scuttled Kyoto. Hagel was a Republican, Byrd was a Democrat. They were both from fossil fuel states. So I just want to make sure that that's on the table because that's a big part of this landscape. And we wouldn't be giving an accurate appraisal of this problem if we didn't have that in a picture.
I just want to throw in just briefly a little visual that makes your point really powerfully. My first byline in the New York Times in 1991, before I was a staffer, was an op-ed. I was a young science writer. I had written my first book on the Amazon, and I was writing my book on global warming. I wrote this op-ed when the wells were burning in Kuwait, and look what was right next to it. And this is, as Naomi says, and others have pointed out really well. Amy Westerveld and other writers have dug in deep on this long. It's really a systemic, systems-based issue of embedded power.
I want to recognize that we are being watched by an audience and that they've posted some questions and comments and sometimes challenges. And maybe we can have some of them shared and then the panelists respond.
Looks like someone, is that Danielle who had posted?
So I highlighted here a question from our audience. I think that's pertinent. What term do we use if not climate emergency? Are we not already beyond a crisis point? So it's a question about public framing around this question and if there are benefits actually to using the term climate emergency.
I think that was a question for Mike, putting you on the spot because you did have some, I think, justified issue with the term emergency.
Whatever. Okay, from my point of view, whatever benefits there are in calling it a climate emergency are benefits that are have got diminishing returns. With something like climate change, if we are now living in a climate emergency, and you're wanting, so for forever we are now living in a climate emergency because how would we end this particular condition that we are in, with humans having significant influence on the climate system? Even on the most optimistic scenarios, it's going to be the end of the century before temperatures are in some sense back to where they are at the present time. So why do governments call emergencies? So okay, I'd make a difference between there's a rhetorical move, which I guess is how most actors have used this. It's a climate emergency as a way to draw attention to how serious these risks and dangers are. But from a government point of view, an emergency is something actually quite different. And this is where the dangers come in, it seems to me politically, of calling this an emergency, particularly under democratic regimes, where we very well know from history what can happen and what does happen in emergency politics. And that's partly what I'm drawing attention to here, that there are some real dangers in using climate change in order to subvert the forms of democracy and political deliberation, reflection, and decision-making that we've cultivated over 100 years or more. And actually, the other way of thinking about this is also the rhetoric of 5 more years, 10 more years, however long it is. We've been down this path so many times. The first one I can remember was back in 1990. And people said we've got until 2005 to sort this problem out. And ever since 1990, we've had deadline after deadline after deadline. It doesn't produce the returns that its promoters would seem to want it to return, which is somehow to mobilize a groundswell of revolution. And I just don't. And I also think by putting these deadlines, 5 years, 10 years, you can actually create conditions which are unnecessarily distracting from the wider sets of repercussions that particular policies will have. If it's only about doing this thing by 10 years' time, you then forget about all the secondary and tertiary implications of emergency policies. So I'm I push back against this type of rhetoric. Practically, psychologically speaking, it doesn't work, and politically, I think it's dangerous.
We could bring another question from the audience. Yeah.
So here's a multi-pronged question from one member of our audience who says that it's apparent that climate change deniers have succeeded in pigeonholing the debate around just the trust in the science itself, pointing to all these studies that contradict conclusions of pro-climate change research. And he asks, why not simply agree that both pro and anti-climate change science are not and cannot be confirmatory? And maybe conceding that will open up a more progressive step in our conversation or politics or, yeah.
Yeah, I think that definitely falls in my bailiwick. Yeah, I guess I'm not entirely comfortable with the framing of that question. I mean, I don't think about the science that I study as being pro or anti-climate. I mean, scientists are involved in a process of trying to understand the natural world, and sometimes that process leads to consensus about issues, sometimes it doesn't. In the case of climate change, we've had consensus among scientists for a pretty long time now that the climate was changing because of human activities, mostly burning fossil fuels and deforestation, and that those changes have significant consequences, many of which are adverse. So one of the strategies and tactics that climate change deniers use, and this gets back to our discussion of is-os, is by challenging that consensus, challenging those findings, claiming it isn't really so, claiming we don't have a consensus. And as you say, they do that by trotting out, some either alleged expert who's actually not, that's most common, or sometimes, a legitimate dissenter who's entitled to his point of view, and I use the word his advisedly, but, is an extreme minority position. And they do this because their own research shows that if people think that the science is unsettled, they are less likely to support action. And even different forms of action, just any action at all. And we know this because in our own research, we found the documents where they talk about, focus groups, studies they've done on this issue. So they themselves understand, and this was a tactic that was used by the tobacco industry as well, that if people think the is part is unsettled, that we don't actually know for sure what's happening, then people are less likely to support action. And therefore, if you want to block action, one way you can do that is by making it seem as if the science is unsettled. And that's why I became interested in this issue in the first place, not because I hold scientists up as some kind of gods. And Mike, I was glad you raised that Monbiot comment, because when he said that thing about how he was devastated and crushed, I wanted to say, well, what do you expect? I mean, it's weird to me that anyone living in the 21st century could actually have that kind of view of science, that they would be so emotionally devastated to discover that scientists are people who are sometimes petty and sometimes get frustrated, and that the climate scientists at East Anglia didn't have a good sense of how they should cope with some of the non-scientific challenges they were facing. So my view is, if we can have a realistic view of what science can and can't do for us, then we don't have to be crushed when scientists make mistakes. And again, as you also said, Mike, I mean, the idea that anyone would say, I won't accept a report that has even one error, I mean, that's just preposterous, right? Even the OED has errors, right? But
it sort of, that illustrates, I use those examples because it just illustrates, at least at that time, 10 years ago, and I think there are traces of that still today, that somehow the relationship that society more broadly has with science, or the expectations that some actors in society have, whether they're politicians or actors, mischievous actors or well-meaning actors have, that there's a misunderstanding, willful or not, of what science can offer. And that was actually the reason why ClimateGate erupted as a controversy, because of these unrealistic expectations that have been below. I mean, to my mind, the reason the IPCC got into trouble was that just 2 years previously it had been awarded the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. What? You're awarding a Peace Prize to a scientific organization? But if you award a Peace Prize to an organization, you raise the stakes immediately, because as soon as you find one error in this organization that's won the Nobel Peace Prize, then the whole edifice is under threat. So you're raising the stakes so high that you're almost bound to create some sort of political crisis that follows from that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I agree with the Peace Prize leads to you can't make an error. But I agree with you that they shouldn't, that getting them the Peace Prize was weird on a lot of grounds. But I think the point is essential, and I think we agree on this, that if you have unrealistic expectations, then sooner or later you will be disappointed in science as in life. And so it's important for us to have realistic expectations, but because of the way in which disinformation exploits uncertainty, I do think it is also important to call it out and to say, no, we do have agreement about these issues. They don't tell us what to do. We have to bring in a whole lot of other considerations, political, social, economic, cultural, value-laden. But, you know, there are certain factual matters that are pretty well settled to the satisfaction of the relevant experts. And we have both the right and good reason to respect that.
Yeah, but this gets back to the big issue of framing. You know, it's like the IPCC, not just the IPCC, the body of the IPCC reports had all the caveats and the complexities, but then, and it wasn't just Pachauri, you had many people who took that ball and ran with it, like Mike described pretty well, and kind of overinterpreted. And when you end up with this kickback, that's where you get what I call whiplash journalism, whiplash science. It kind of, if you're not paying attention to what we don't know, to the levels of caveat. And there is, again, you know, sea level rise is, I think, the example I keep coming back to, or climate sensitivity. We know we don't know what the temperature will be in 2100. We deeply know we don't know how high sea levels are going to rise by 2100. That's like powerfully known. It's certainty that we are not going to clarify that. And that's the difference between a true calamity and something manageable. So you end up back, when this gets into the societal arena, if you're not acknowledging the error bars around these talking points, then we end up stuck again with this reverberation that I think enables stasists, because it's so easy to maintain stasis. It's so hard to drive change.
Right, but if I can jump in though, because this is really important, and I feel like our conversation is a little bit at risk of being too much on the side of worrying about people over-interpreting, but the opposite is true. People can also under-interpret. And the IPCC, as you know, has stood on its head to outline the uncertainties, the error bars, all of that. And that also makes it possible for a lot of people, I think, to under-interpret the risk. So, you know, how do we get it right? I don't know. That's a really complicated question. And there's obviously plenty of blame to go around. But I think, you know, we know a lot scientifically. I think we are right to defend what we know scientifically against people who, you know, try to challenge it for illegitimate reasons. But we're also right to acknowledge that this is a complex problem with many different angles, and it won't be solved by one thing. But again, many of the potential solutions potential solutions are available. And we can begin to move in those directions, but that does require a certain kind of commitment to say, yes, we don't know everything, and there are some things we will never know. There are some things we hopefully will learn, although by the time we learn them, it may be too late. So if we have to take action, as we would in our lives, we make decisions based on the information we have available at the time we need to make the decision. And we have an awful lot of information. I mean, we know, yes, there's a lot about the climate system we don't know, but on the other hand, we probably know more about the climate system now than we did, well, you know, if you think about acid rain or ozone, some of these other issues that we took steps to act on, we know more about the climate system now, I would argue, than we knew about the ozone situation, particularly when the Vienna Protocol was passed. So I don't want us to leave with the impression that the thing is so complicated and such a mess and so uncertain that, you know, there's nothing reasonable that we can do. I don't think that would be a good impression to leave the audience with today.
No, I would agree. But then on the other hand, just to take Andy's point, in a sense, it doesn't help policy making or prioritizing things that we know we can do and should do in the short term to argue, well, is sea level rise going to be 50 centimeters or 1.5 meters by 2000? That question doesn't actually make any difference at all to the sort of policy. So why are we pushing all these scientific buttons? Almost, you know, we're trying to put a second or a third or a fourth decimal point on things that we don't need a second or a third decimal point on.
I agree completely.
But because climate change has been so wrapped up in this science-driven narrative, or a science-first line of argumentation, that it's very easy to overplay that science card, and this is what scientists can do. And this is back to Andy's point about self-interest. Scientists want to do more science. Of course, they want to do more science. They want more money. They want a bigger model. And they want, you know, another $1 billion fund that model. Whereas actually the return, the societal or the policy return on that extra $1 billion and the extra decimal point is trivial. And yet it sells because we've oversaturated the climate debate with a science-first narrative.
Or it's actually in the interest of people in power to just keep funding science. I mean, I think what I would definitely agree on is that same money would be far better spent on social science research.
Yes. To understand it'd be far better spent on solutions and
yeah.
Well, I've made that point recently. I held a discussion on energy innovation, that component, and it was mostly people talking about energy innovation in terms of better chemistry for batteries and stuff. But I had Indra Overland, a sociologist who had recently published a paper showing the disparity in funding for social science on climate versus climate science on climate, and it's vast. It's like several orders of magnitude less. And if we don't understand the social climate better, we're never going to really get at this issue better. And that's science we need to do more of. And I'm not saying that just because there's social scientists on the call here. It's because as a journalist, I look at this and it took me way too long. I know we're running a little long. Is that okay, Naomi? Can you hang on a little bit?
Actually, I do need to wrap up because I've got another call.
Yeah, okay. 45. Well, basically, my first 18 years of prize-winning journalism on climate change, from 1988 to 2006, it took till 2006 for me to call the social scientist. And it was Helen Ingram at UC Irvine, and she like dropped a huge brick on me, which is this body of science showing that, guess what, if you don't understand the climate in here, you're not going to do much about the climate out there. And it really, that changed my whole track as a reporter, broke my narrative. So bravo to all of you who are, I love CI scientists too, but yeah, we need more of this. That's just me.
So I think this would be a good moment to stop. And since Naomi has to leave, and this was indeed our allotted time, and I really would like to thank Mike and Naomi and Andy for this really, really fascinating conversation. I think we managed to get you to disagree with one another and, throw a few punches here and there. And that's what a good debate should do. And I must say I've learned an enormous amount just from the back and forth. And I think the audience could also see the 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensions and sides of the problem. So thank you for this. I want to thank also Danielle and Danielle for preparing well for this meeting, posing tough questions that indeed got you guys going, and then also helping us with the questions from the audience. And I want to thank the audience as well for, even though they are distant, participating in this discussion, which definitely should continue. So Andy, I don't know if you want to have a plug-in for Sustain What?
Yeah, I was just trying to show something at the end there, but Sustain What is, it's a series of conversations trying to drive progress around kind of moments and issues where complexity and consequence collide. And climate change is the long emergency of if there ever was one, and so there'll be more of these. I'm hoping you can all come back. We should revisit these issues. We could just do one where we flip the script here, Gil, and we all ask you questions about expertise and humanity, and this is brought to you by by Columbia University, the Earth Institute, and now the Climate School. Tune in tomorrow for Wednesday for a session with the great botanist Peter Raven and some young botanists, 2 different levels. Angelica Patterson, who was a fantastic shotgun botanist. She uses a shotgun to get the flowers and from way up high in a forest. She's also the principal force behind the Black in Botany, Black in Science movements on social media. That's Wednesday. Much more coming, of course. Thank you all for being part of this. I love these takeovers of my platform, and let's do more of them. And Naomi, let's get you back. And Mike, too. Right. It's been like a decade, so this is great. And last thing, everyone out there, this gets archived right away on whatever platform you're watching on. You can share this, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and keep the conversation going. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone.
Great.
Thanks, Gil.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.